in any field, any area, you'll find sins of omission and sins of commission. Welcome to Oral Tradition and another adventure in Guyanese and world literatures. And let's welcome, here is one. Let's welcome a literary detective. How's that? And an independent researcher. Two independent persons. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, I'm happy about that. Sins of commission, sins of omission, in respect to literature, in respect to women writing. Talk about this omission, both sins of omission and commission, with respect to women and women writing. Alison?
Yes, maybe it's not so much a sin in my conceptualization, but just the way that preferences become piled upon later preferences and things slip out of sight very easily. So I think often what struck me in my work as a literary detective is even writers who were really quite well known in their day have slipped out of view, because actually the number of writers that we focus on over time reduces, distills. And sadly, in relation to Caribbean literary traditions, it's the women that have fallen away. Mm-hmm. Now, that's obviously not incidental, and I'm happy to talk about why I think that is. But I think that's certainly... So I think, if anything, it's more neglect than omission. I think it's the way in which we read the past and we keep going back. Shevchenko's dog, we go back to the forest to the same tree that's marked over and over again, and all those other trees are lost. So I'm interested in kind of wandering through the forest in other ways, and I'm particularly interested, but not exclusively interested, in the women that we've forgotten.
But you know, in my book, women have always been leaders. Women have always been the custodians of everything, our oral history, our traditions, and they've got a voice. I know this for a fact. So, how were they diminished?
I think that's to do with metropolitan publishing largely. And it's to do with what's seen as valuable. And I think particularly it's interesting you say that they have a strong voice in an oral tradition, because I think increasingly what happened was this kind of separation between work that was seen of cultural value and work that was seen as of literary value, and maybe work that was seen as educational value. And women's voices and women's knowledge was often separated out from the literary into cultural or educational knowledge. And the men went on to be published by FEB and Secker and all of these prestigious houses. And literary critics look back through those channels. They forget to look back through the educational and through the cultural. And so I think they've missed a lot. We've missed a lot. I've missed a lot. So there's a lot to catch up on. But I agree that in many ways, these women were extraordinary.
Lisa?
I think for me it is also a matter of retracing what was already there. So in a way it is a kind of detective work, but I focus primarily on contemporary writers. So I think part of what I try to do is to really understand, especially in the case of Indo-Caribbean women writers, what are the various forms of cultural expressions that have already been there, mm-hmm. in ways that we don't always define as literary, or in ways that we don't always define as activists or as strong female voices, in ways that we already have conceptions about what a feminist voice might sound like. So, for example, some of the same concerns around what are the writers, for example, who've been valorized by metropolitan publishing houses and so on, what kinds of other local voices, local pathways for publishing, for women who are writing diaries, for women who are writing short stories or poems and self-publishing right now. How does it widen our sense of a landscape of what Indo-Caribbean women's activism might look like? So in some places that is in the art world, in some places that's in writing, but in other places it's also in educating your children or making space for other voices that perhaps in a generation or two ago weren't recognizable as doing something transgressive or something strong in the ways in which you're describing. So in part for me it's an interest in tracing a kind of genealogy between what was already there and what is happening now in contemporary voices.
History, contemporary literature. It's lovely to have the text, the history, the criticism and appreciation. I'm happy to have you. So we'll explore the text, the history, and the contemporary slant in literature. Let's go to Guyana. And Alison, you look at some of our writers that you've been focusing on and bring your opening to bear upon these writers.
Well, in particular, I've been trying to piece together the literary career of Edwina Melville. And if we want to talk about an extraordinary woman, there's one certainly. I think that she was such a committed writer, and yet I think probably most people who know about her life in Guyana probably know about her political life, or maybe her environmental activism, her advocacy for the Rupununi, and maybe don't really know that she had a literary career. And in her case, it's particularly poignant because she was trying to find an outlet at home in Guyana, and she really struggled to find that. And so she was sending her stories to the BBC Caribbean Voices.
Imagine that.
And, you know, we know how special that program was, how it helped to make the career of you know, Walcott and Naipaul and Sulky and Mittelholzer. And, you know, they were so well received that one of her pieces was one of only 2 of the Caribbean Voices stories selected to be published on the front of the BBC magazine, The Listener. And in his diary, which has only recently been published, Henry Swansea whispers to himself that this story is the most vivid piece of writing to have been broadcast on the General Overseas Service. So he ranks her, you know, as one of his top writers. He doesn't tell her that, which is a kind of sadness to me. And he whispers it into his diary, whereas he's contacting agents and publishers for the writers in London, the male writers. So trying to piece that story together, you know, I was very lucky as well to come across your piece where you'd mentioned that she published in Blackwood magazine. And I think that really, you know, you were the only person to pick her up as a writer after her death. So I was lucky. I found one story of hers on eBay and then went in search and traced all the way through the archives in Scotland. And not only is she a beautiful writer, but she's an amazing correspondent. She has these completely, well, we would call today oversharing. She overshares totally. So she's writing to Captain Blackwood, who's a very buttoned up Scotsman, and she's telling him everything that's happening in the house. Like she tells Swansea, you know, she says to Swansea, I must just tell you what's happening. The children are fighting and everything. So she all the time was kind of really trying to match her writing and her life together. And it just didn't work for the kinds of professional authorship that was available at the time. So she wins a prize for the Blackwoods magazine. Again, she's up there, you know, with the kind of Conrads and Elliots, and she's being recognised, you know, in Edinburgh and in London for her writing. But she never really found a foothold. So there are all these beautiful fragments and stories left behind, but hers is really, I think, a literary career still to be cherished, and still to be explored.
Yeah, it brings to me mind, is it Stephanie Correa? The artist and writer? You came across her?
No, I don't think so.
Ah, well, we'll catch up on that.
Yes.
Lisa, your take on a contemporary Guyanese writer that we may have overlooked, or anyone that you focus on?
Well, I think in terms of the struggles for how it is that you can balance these various roles, it's something that we find in women's writing often. Two of the Guyanese writers specifically that I've looked at, or two novels that I've looked at more recently, were Ryan Shaw's A Silent Life and Nirmala Sweetcharan's Tomorrow is Another Day. And in both of those novels, you also find this struggle with how it is that you can claim these multiple spaces, the space to be a writer, the space to be a creative presence, but while also feeling the pressures of both family life and societal expectations for roles that women are able to occupy. And I think those are writers that are also writing within traditions where their Caribbean writing itself is now a canon, and there are certain understandings of the types of figures who are writers and the types of topics that they cover. So in some ways, what we find with writers like those are the ways in which they try to bring the intimate spaces of women's lives and the intricate crossings of questions around ethnic identity, as well as gendered ones, as well as classed ones, into the spaces of their work. And they often emerge in ways that, are sometimes surprising. Sometimes there are themes, especially around madness, that emerge in these works, in part because of the difficulty that the writers are representing of trying to juggle all of these multiple pressures that are placed on their protagonists, which in some ways is also, a stand-in for the kinds of difficulties of clearing space to be a writer within, at home, or in the diaspora. Another writer who's of interest to me is a poet by the name of Nadia Messire, who is of Guyanese origin, but living in the diaspora in New York. And an interest of mine recently has been in trying to trace the ways in which folklore is used, employed in women's writing. And Nadia Messire has a very interesting poem called, if I remember the title correctly, it's Manual for a Tongue is the shortened version. It's not the full one. But in it, she uses the figure of the Charal, the folklore figure of a woman who has died in childbirth, to describe the sensation, the intimate feeling of dragging as a child of the diaspora behind oneself a forgotten language, the tongue of your mothers and of your grandmothers and of your foremothers. And so there too we find fascinating ways in contemporary literary expressions of trying to manage the sometimes impossible meeting of identities and of demands that are placed on female subjects within their respective worlds.
Alison, how do we deal with that? I mean, how do women deal with that, these sort of pressures?
In many ways, I guess there is the negative consequences, the pressures, the challenges, the work that doesn't get written, and I'm very conscious of that.
But it should make them stronger, I think.
Well, I was just going to say, but the other side of that is actually the resourcefulness, the kind of determination, the passion, the kinds of fierce articulation and the fierce commitment to writing.